Well, the opposition is widening its gap in the primary vote, according to the latest news poll, pushing its lead over the coalition in the primary vote to 4% now. Joining us live is Finance Minister Simon Birmingham. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for your time this morning. So it's not just one poll, as you know. There's a whole series of them. You must be concerned about the consistency of them.
Look, Pete, we saw in the last election campaign just how wrong polls can be. Ultimately, Australians are starting to vote from today, and on Saturday week, most Australians will cast their vote. And they will be focusing, I'm sure, on the choice at this election, and it's a very stark choice between Scott Morrison, who has led Australia through some of the most challenging times we've ever lived through, and continues to deliver an economic plan that's got our unemployment rate down to the lowest levels in nearly 50 years, has a plan to drive that even lower and to provide economic security in very uncertain times, versus Anthony Albanese, a leader who continues to stumble and fumble over basic economic questions, over questions about his own policies, which are falling apart at the seams. And even in last night's debate, we could see that Anthony Albanese didn't understand how his policies would drive electricity prices higher. He couldn't explain in relation to how his housing policy would work. He couldn't explain how or where he was going to find the nurses to provide for his aged care policy. It's just a demonstration that Anthony Albanese is out of his depth and not up to the job.
Although wages are going backwards and everything is becoming more expensive under your watch.
But we do face huge international economic pressures, as we do huge international security pressures at present. And there's no doubting that those economic pressures around the world have fuelled inflation in a range of ways. Australia is not immune to that, but we are withstanding it better than most other countries. If you look at last week in terms of our Reserve Bank's decision, it was followed in the days after by decisions in the US and the UK, jacking up interest rates in those places by bigger amounts off of higher bases than what we had in Australia. And so we are managing through these very challenging international times to outperform other countries with our jobs growth higher, our unemployment rate lower, and keeping inflation and those other pressures lower. Labor are going into this election campaign with some big spending promises, and we can see revelations today that there'd be around $67 billion of extra debt piled on under an Albanese government. That sort of spending is only going to put more pressure on inflation, more pressure on interest rates, and risk even higher taxes under a Labor government.
OK, we do, as everyone knows now, have our own economic pressures here. We've got a pretty big and sizable national security pressure over in the Solomon Islands, and details have emerged this morning of what China may well be planning to do. It wants to help build wharves, shipyards, submarine cables, to name just a few, as part of these documents. Is that not a clear intention of a move to a naval base?
Pete, I think we should firstly note that within the Solomon Islands themselves, there is some intense debate within their parliament and their political system about the agreement that was signed with China and these issues. Now, we've continued to note and to welcome the commitments from the Solomon Islands Prime Minister that there will not be a foreign military base established in the Solomon Islands, and indeed when the Foreign Minister met with her Solomon Islands counterpart just last week, we again noted and acknowledged that commitment from the Solomon Islands, and that's a commitment that we...
Do you still believe that after these details
the whole family
today?
of Pacific Island nations... Well, Pete, it's a commitment that we, together with all of the Pacific Island nations, are intent on making sure is upheld, and we will continue to engage closely. As I said, these are also matters hotly debated within the Solomon Islands themselves. Now, that's a matter of their democracy and their processes.
Sure, but that must be alarming, though. I mean, all of this, sorry to interrupt you, I just want to talk about this point here. I mean, there's wharves, shipyards, submarine cables. That all leads in one direction, which is not what you're saying.
Well, Pete, all of these things underscore indeed the pressure we face in our region, and it's not a pressure that we hadn't foreseen. It's why we've increased defence spending from what Labor had at the lowest level since 1938 under their defence cuts. We've lifted that to 2% of GDP and growing. We're investing and expanding our defence forces by more than 18,000.
Yeah.
In relation to the Pacific, it's why we've opened multiple new embassies and diplomatic missions across the Pacific Island countries, putting Australia as the only nation to have an embassy or a high commission in every Pacific Island nation. We know that this is a hotly contested region and environment that we operate in. We've seen what China's done in the South China Sea. We've seen what they've done with Hong Kong. We've seen what they do to their own people in terms of the Uyghurs, the pressure they're exerting across a range of international institutions. And it's why Australia needs strong and stable leadership at this time to continue to respond to these pressures. We won't win every argument or every decision that we want around the region, but we absolutely need a government that Australians can trust to keep growing that defence spending and to make sure that we have strong, stable leadership.
Just a quick one here. We've only got a minute left, Minister, but Labor wants to pay 5,000 top students up to $12,000 a year to study an education degree. Will that help get more teachers into schools?
This is classic Labor policy of throwing more money at a problem. What we're focused on doing is ensuring that the minimum standards for every person coming through a teaching qualification are high standards of literacy, high standards of numeracy, so that Australians can have confidence that those graduating in the future are all up to the job, not just a handful of ones that Labor want to throw some cash at.
All right, Finance Minister Simon Birmingham, thanks for your time. We'll talk to you again soon.